I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person at this important meeting, but at least I'm able to appear to you through modern technology and to say something about the concept of soft power, as I've been asked to do. If one thinks about power, it's the ability to affect others to get the outcomes that you want. And you can affect others in three different ways. You can affect them by coercion, threats. Sometimes we call that sticks. You can affect them by payments or inducements, which we often refer to in slang as carrots. And you can also affect them by attraction, of getting others to want the things that you want. Needless to say, the more you can get through attraction, the less you have to spend on carrots and sticks. This concept of soft power, the third way that I just mentioned, is sometimes ignored. Indeed, one can make an argument that in the last administration, the American foreign policy didn't pay enough attention to soft power. It focused perhaps too much on the first two aspects of military and economic power that I lump together as hard power. I think we're seeing now in this current administration a greater emphasis on soft power. If you look at the inaugural statement that President Obama made, he said that our power comes not simply from our military might, but from our values. That's a good example of soft power. So also is the speech that he delivered recently in Cairo, in which he referred to the need for mutual respect as we develop policies toward the Muslim world. So in the sense, soft power is with us, though we sometimes forget it. But we forget it to our peril. It was interesting that when Secretary of State Clinton was having her hearings for confirmation in the role of Secretary of State, she said that the Obama administration would be focusing more on smart power. And smart power essentially is the term that I developed to refer to the combination of hard and soft power. Soft power isn't the answer to all problems, but neither is hard power. The ability to combine soft and hard power in different settings is what I call smart power. In fact, in a recent book, my most recent book, called The Powers to Lead, I say that the key skill for a leader in today's world is the ability to understand changing contexts and changing situations, to know how to adjust the mix of hard and soft power skills into smart strategies. But let me return to the level of the country or the state rather than the level of the leader, the individual leader, and say that when we look at international politics, we notice that soft power matters, not just in individual relations, but in relations among states. I came up with this term soft power 20 years ago when I was writing a book called Bound to Lead, which was about the question of whether the United States was in decline. At that time, it was widely believed that the United States was finished as a power, that it was going the way of Philip II Spain and Victoria's England. I didn't think that was right, and I tried to do a calculus of the various resources that produce hard military power and the resources that produce hard economic power. But when I'd finished with that, I said, there's still something missing. We're still missing the fact that the United States is able to attract other countries, and it is doing things the right way. And that's when I decided to call this third form of power soft power. Now, soft power is not the possession of the United States alone. Anybody and any country can have soft power, but the resources that produce soft power for a country tend to be three major types. One is a country's culture, when the culture is attractive to others. A second is a country's values, when it actually lives up to those values and they attract others. And the third is a country's policies, when those policies are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others. Now, culture is often referred to as high and low culture, elite culture or popular culture. In fact, all aspects of culture can be important. The idea that high culture or literary or elite culture can be attractive is something I think most people experience. But in addition, the effect of something like films or songs can make a country more or less attractive. Now, it doesn't work in all ways at all places. Take, for example, Hollywood films. Those may be attractive in some places, but not others. For example, if you see a film which shows women dressed in bikinis and working and divorcing their husbands, that can be attractive perhaps in some area where there's a desire for greater liberty for women, greater freedom for women, but it can be repulsive in others, let's say Saudi Arabia or a conservative Muslim culture. So a cultural artifact, such as a film, may produce soft power or attraction in certain circumstances and not in others. Indeed, it can happen inside a single country. For example, in Iran, the ruling mullahs regard Hollywood films as part of the great Satan. On the other hand, a younger generation of Iranian often wants nothing more than to have a cassette of an American film to show in the privacy of their home. So culture can be an attractive a resource or not, depending on the audience, and that can vary. The second thing I mentioned is a resource that can produce soft power, or values. If values are broad and universal and attract others, they obviously can produce a positive effect for a country. But the country has to live up to them. For example, if you find that a country speaks of freedom or liberty and doesn't act on it at home, that can undercut the attraction or possible soft power that can come from such values. For years, the United States practiced racial segregation in the American South. President Eisenhower in the 1950s realized that as African countries were beginning to become independent, that these practices at home were undercutting American soft power. Now, nearly half a century later, the United States has its first African American president, and I think that's helped greatly to show that the values that were in the Declaration of Independence, that all men were created equal, we didn't live up to them for quite some time, but they were there and they made a difference. In the end, it has shown its effect. And that's why I think something like, for example, the election of Barack Obama has enhanced American soft power in the sense that it's shown that we are indeed, at least in part, living up to the values that we profess. The third source of soft power that I mentioned was the policies that a country pursues and whether those policies are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others. It's not enough just to proclaim your policies to be legitimate. It's how they appear in the other's eyes that makes the difference. A good deal of the problems that the United States encountered under the Bush administration, the recent Bush administration, was a feeling that policies like the invasion of Iraq without a United Nations mandate was not legitimate. And that essentially undercut American soft power. Indeed, if you look at public opinion polls around the world, you can see considerable decline in American attractiveness as measured by polls in Europe, Latin America, and almost all of the Muslim world. Now, if you think about the question of legitimacy, you realize that to the extent that a country can pursue policies which are in its national interest, or good for itself, but also in the interest of others, those policies are likely to be more legitimate. And that's why it's important that a country pursue what's been called global public goods. A public good is something which can benefit everyone. Clean air, for example, is a public good. If I improve the quality of the air, it helps me, but it helps you as well. And there are, in global affairs, certain things that are public goods. Freedom of the seas, access to the internet, let's say dealing with global climate change, stable international financial system. All these are good for the country that's helping to promote it, but good for other countries as well. The extent to which the United States is able to orient its foreign policy toward developing global public goods also will increase its soft power. Now, I've spoken a lot about the United States simply because I'm American and the U.S. is the largest power, and I wanted to try to illustrate it with that. But don't make the mistake of thinking that soft power inheres in the United States alone. Clearly it does not. Take a country like Norway, which is not part of the European Union. Not many people speak Norwegian, and it's a country, though, which has used its policies to enhance its legitimacy. For example, Norway has spent 1% of its gross domestic product on overseas development assistance. It has tried to act as the peacemaker in places like the Middle East, and that essentially has added legitimacy to Norway's policy. So while Norway, with its 5 million or so people, is not going to be a superpower, nonetheless it can do what the British call punch above its weight. It can be taken more seriously because of the soft power that's engendered by the legitimacy of Norwegian policies. So that's to illustrate the point that any country can develop soft power and use it. You don't have to be a superpower. But let me turn back to the larger countries and some historical examples. If one looks back at the Cold War, what's interesting to realize is that the Cold War was a situation where there was a combination of hard and soft power into a smart power strategy. American military might, the NATO alliance, together helped to deter Soviet aggression against the European countries that were neighboring it. But the thing that's worth noticing is that it wasn't just military might that mattered. It also mattered that there were ideas that were flowing behind the Iron Curtain, which meant that people became disillusioned with the authoritarian communist system. And that meant that when the Berlin Wall finally went down, it did not succumb to a barrage of artillery. It succumbed to hammers and bulldozers wielded by those who had lost faith in their systems. That's an example of how soft power contributed to the end of the Cold War. Now, think about today and the situation that we face when we think about the threats that are posed by extreme violence from certain small segments of Islam, particularly Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. If you say, how can you defeat bin Laden, you're not going to be able to do it by guns alone. Yes, it's true that you need to use military forces against those who are trying to attack and kill you. But the real secret to success in a case like this is going to be to combine soft power with hard power. The soft power is not going to convert bin Laden. Clearly his mind is made up. The soft power, though, may attract those in the Muslim mainstream who have a lot more diverse values than those that are expressed by bin Laden. In that sense, the ability to attract others to prevent them from being recruited to the radical cause is an illustration of how soft power can play an important role, along with hard power, in a smart strategy for dealing with the types of threats that we face today. Now, soft power can't solve all problems. For example, Kim Jong-il, the North Korean dictator, is alleged to like to watch American films, but that's not going to have any effect on his nuclear policy. If you want to follow that through, probably the only way in which you can have leverage on North Korea is if the Chinese were to use their hard power of economic sanctions. After all, they supply the food and fuel that keeps North Korea going. That might have some effect, but attraction of the North Korean regime is not likely to be successful. But just because you can't achieve everything with soft power doesn't mean that it's not important. For example, if you're thinking about some types of goals, which are goals affecting the general climate or environment, you need soft power. Take democracy and human rights. We have an interest in promoting democracy and human rights, but it's very hard to promote them with the barrel of a gun. The idea that you can enforce democracy by shooting is not plausible. What you can do, however, is set examples and provide ideas that can attract others to find their own paths to democracy. Sometimes in one tradition of American foreign policy, this has been called the role of the shining city on the hill. Ronald Reagan used that term, though it goes back much earlier. But that is different from imposing ideas. If we're going to be successful in attracting others, we have to pay attention to the diversity of the views and culture of others. We have to learn to listen more. John Kennedy at one point said that we need to make the world not just safe for democracy, but safe for diversity. Different countries will find their own paths, their own interpretations of democracy. But the fact that they can do so, and that we're prepared to be helpful when asked, and that we can set models which others might find attractive, that's where the soft power component comes in. And I think the mistake of the policy of invading Iraq was the mistake of thinking that you can impose democracy with the barrel of a gun. Let me say a word or two about the problems of using soft power. It's important to realize that soft power is often not wielded solely by governments. Much of soft power is developed by civil society. For example, if you look at American soft power, much of the attractiveness that it is produced for the country comes from non-governmental organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with its program to combat HIV/AIDS, or like the American universities, which attract students to come to the United States, or even Hollywood and films that sometimes are terrible, but sometimes attract people to values of individualism and liberty and free choices. So civil society generates a great deal of the attractive culture which can produce soft power. But notice that the government can't control it, or indeed, if the government were to try to control it, it would violate the values of a liberal approach, which essentially are another dimension of soft power. It's interesting, if you think of the role of popular culture, to notice that India, a democracy, has a vibrant film industry in Bollywood, larger perhaps than Hollywood, and China, equally as large as India in size and with many talented filmmakers, doesn't have that kind of popular presence. In part, I think that may be the fact that censorship sets limits on what Chinese filmmakers can do. But in any case, popular culture when the government tries to control it, may turn out not to be a soft power resource because people are not trusting it, that the government is doing what it's doing. Another problem with soft power is that not just that the government can't control it, but that it's often very slow. If you want to accomplish something quickly and you invade a country, you perhaps can overthrow a government in a matter of days or weeks. If you want to convert people's ideas to democracy, for example, it may take a generation or a decade. And very often politicians are not very patient. They want results that they can show to the electorate in the short term without having to wait to a period when they're no longer in office. So the fact that soft power is not within government control fully, and that it's not completely and not often quick in its results and responses makes it sometimes a tool which politicians underuse compared to what they should be doing. In any case, I think it's also worth remembering that soft power is not good per se. Soft power can be used for bad purposes. Whether an act of power is good or bad depends on the purpose for which it's used, not the type of power as such. It's not necessarily better to twist minds than it is to twist arms. To use a little example, if I want to steal your money, I can take out a gun and shoot you and steal your wallet. Or I can persuade you that I am a guru who's going to save the world and you should sign over your bank account to me, and then I abscond with the funds. In both cases, the results are bad. In both cases, it's theft. Though in the case of soft power, you have a few more degrees of freedom of choice than you do with the hard power. Now, it's also worth remembering that some people have soft power and use it for very bad purposes. Take bin Laden. We sometimes think of bin Laden as a man who is just using violence. In fact, bin Laden didn't threaten with violence those who flew into the World Trade Center and killed 3,000 civilians. He didn't pay them. What he did was attract them to his strange and extreme version of religion. That was bin Laden's soft power. And in that sense, it's worth remembering that soft power can be used for bad purposes as well as good. But with all that taken into account, with all those caveats, it's still worth noticing that in today's information age, soft power is going to become somewhat more important. The world is not merely going to be a world of whose army wins, but also whose story wins. And we're going to have to pay more attention to the stories that are told, their credibility, and also the values that they portray. Soft power depends more on the perception of those upon whom it is wielded than does hard power, which means that it has to involve more listening, more meeting people halfway. And in that sense, I think you could argue that the speech that Obama gave in Cairo was a great example of soft power. He talked about the need for mutual respect, the need for better listening, the need for understanding if we were going to reach agreement on common policies and common interests. So I think what we're seeing in American foreign policy is a move away from some of the extreme emphasis on hard power that was typical of the early years of the George W. Bush administration, in which you had people saying that the world was unipolar and the U.S. could do what it wanted, to a greater realization that in today's world it makes a huge difference whether you can get others to cooperate, to come along with you in producing global public goods, and that requires soft power. So while soft power is not necessarily better than hard power, it could be used for bad purposes, by and large it's going to become increasingly important in a global information age, and I think it can help us to mobilize the type of cooperation that we need if we're going to deal with some of the threats we face, like global climate change, a stable financial system, and so forth. So I hope these thoughts have been of some value to you as you have your discussions and deliberations at your very important meetings. And I'm just sorry again that I can't be with you in person, but I leave you with these thoughts to add to your conversations. Thank you very much for your attention.